Hey guys, it's Rachel. It's Thankful Thursday. I'm back on my usual slot. I know I uploaded a video on Saturday because I didn't get a chance last week at all. So I'm making my video on my normal day, which is Thursday. And this week we are doing a rotation. I know Ariel mentioned it, concerning eating disorders and other mental health problems. I can't exactly remember the order of what we're going to do, but certainly for today and for this week we're going to be looking at the subjects of eating disorders, depression and self-harm. This is something that I'm sure many of you can relate to. I'm sure it isn't something that doesn't run parallel with many people's eating disorders. Although many may not self-harm, certainly depression can be something that more often than not underlies the eating disorder or is a result of the eating disorder. I'm going to break them up, which I don't really like to do, certainly not when it comes to dealing with them as a whole, and I will explain some of that a little bit later. So what I'm going to start with is looking at the three of them, perhaps discussing each of them separately and then how they come together, and then what my opinion is with regards to treating those difficulties. My opinion that I have in terms of how they are treated is personal to me, and it comes from a place that isn't just concerning myself and my recovery, but from working with people with those difficulties. To start with, in my personal experience, the thing that came first was the eating disorder. I developed anorexia very, very quickly. I perhaps had an underlying depression. That isn't something that has been able to be clarified, and for many of you out there it's very difficult to say which came first. Is a person depressed? Does a person who's depressed develop an eating disorder because of the depression, or does the eating disorder lead to a person to be depressed? Some people start with a form of childhood depression. That is something that only in hindsight have we been able to look back, when I say we, in my therapy, and say, okay, when I was 14 there was a degree of childhood depression there. I have been told that that was most definitely there. Again, it is backwards and forwards, different opinions, different people have different things. Things certainly weren't right at that age for me. I struggled integrating with people at school at that point, and I had a lot of problems in my family. I had a lot of problems with my relationship with my father at that time. My way of dealing with what was going on for me was to shut myself out, was to isolate myself. And there were behaviours there which weren't normal, and I'm not going to go into those now, but they certainly weren't things that somebody who wasn't dealing with some form of depression would have been dealing with. I can mention them briefly, but they were connected to headbanging and ligaturing, and that isn't something that I particularly want to go into huge amounts of detail with, and it's the same with any form of self-harm, because I don't particularly think that that's helpful for you right now watching these videos. When I was 19, a lot of people know my story, 17, 18, 19, I was in a very abusive relationship. My anorexia developed very, very quickly. It took a number of months for me to be diagnosed, and when I was diagnosed I was put into treatment. I don't remember particularly being overwhelmingly depressed at that point. I was low, I had little energy, I didn't particularly want to socialise, but a lot of that was connected to being anorexic. I didn't want to socialise because I was scared that somebody would make me eat. I didn't want to go and spend the night at friends because I might have to eat. I didn't want to have to always be with my boyfriend or girlfriend or whoever because I might be in a position to eat. The only way I felt like I could deal with myself was to shut myself away, was to not have those interactions so that I wasn't in that position. Things like over-exercising took over my life. The whole eating disorder took over my life. Now, a couple of years into my eating disorder, I started to deal with what felt like depression. Depression feels like hiding. Depression feels like not wanting to get out of bed. Depression feels exhausting. Depression feels like not wanting to talk or interact. Depression feels like keeping those curtains closed because you don't want to face the day. Depression means that everything feels overwhelming. It means that going to work feels too much. Speaking on the phone feels too much. Some days even getting out of bed feels too much. Depression means that you don't have any motivation. It means that you don't want to get dressed, you don't want to eat, you don't want to look at yourself in the mirror, you don't want to deal with life, you don't want to have to deal with people, you don't want to be made to laugh, you just don't want to do anything. How you feel about yourself is horrible. You feel like you're not worth anything, you feel that you don't deserve good things. Now all of these things started to happen for me, and I didn't realise that it was depression until I was told it was depression. The word depression gets thrown around a lot. I'm depressed, I feel depressed because of this. And a word that is used, and it's normally in history really, is melancholy. And melancholy is to do with that low mood, and for me that word sums up a lot more than the word depression does. So as my eating disorder not even escalated but became a bigger part of me, became something more and more prominent in my life, my mood started to shift and change. Was I depressed before I started to use eating disorder behaviours? I don't know, but for me personally, I think that the eating disorder came first. Then the mood issues came, because there's millions of reasons why a person gets depressed. It's to do with not feeding yourself properly, it's to do with what goes on in your brain. It's a million and one things, and that's why it's very difficult to separate them out, because they are kind of entangled in one another. A few years into my eating disorder is when I started to self-harm. My self-harm at that point was connected to self-cutting and burning, and they were the distinguished ways in which I was hurting myself. Again, those behaviours escalated as time went on, and the span of self-harm became greater. A lot of people don't realise that some of the behaviours they're using are self-injury, because it's a common myth that self-injury is about cutting or burning yourself. Self-injury for one person can be their eating disordered behaviours. Self-injury can be their purging, or their binging and purging, or their binging, or over-exercise, or eating X amount of calories. Self-injury can then be the cutting, the burning, scratching, hitting, biting, banging your head, pulling your hair out. And I'm not saying all of these things to give you all ideas, and please don't take it as that. I'm saying it because I think people don't often link those behaviours into a self-harm spectrum. And when a person is using self-harm behaviours and has an eating disorder, it becomes very complex, because a lot of the eating disorder behaviours can be a self-harm. I've known people who eat food that has gone off, and it's a way of attacking themselves. Bulimia in that way has a voice that is very attacking. It's very physical. People often think that anorexia isn't self-injury in that same way, because it's not you attacking your body in the sense of cutting yourself or purging, but it is attacking yourself, and it might seem very quiet, but it's actually very chaotic, and it's very out of control. And when we feel that we are in control because we are restricting to X amount and our weight is X amount, actually inside we are screaming. And that is the voice that needs to come out. That is quite often where there's a lot of anger, and it's being repressed, it's being forced down, and it is expressed through self-injury, it is expressed through not eating enough, it is expressed through drinking, and these are other aspects that I think we're going to look at, but we have looked at drinking and eating disorders quite closely. So self-harm and eating disorders become incredibly entwined, and it becomes very difficult to know why we are doing which. On top of all of that, a mood disorder makes it even more complicated. most people I know who have an eating disorder also self-harm. Not everybody, and that doesn't make their issues any less, but most people who I've come into contact with do. The number of people who don't have any form of self-injury behaviour and an eating disorder tends to be fewer rather than more. That can sometimes make treating a person's illness very difficult. There's been research that has said that people who have eating disorders alone, it is more difficult to treat than people who have other behaviours. That can be for different reasons. I think for me, part of what led to my recovery from my eating disorder was being tired of self-harming and being tired of being depressed. And when a person has an eating disorder alone, they are some of the reasons with regards to depression that can spur a person into recovery, because at the end of the day, and I say this to people, your eating disorder is making you depressed, your eating disorder is making you anxious, your eating disorder is making you withdraw. All of those things are not pleasant experiences, and I'm not saying that your eating disorder is a pleasant experience, but people tend to want to hold on to their eating disorder because they like the control of restricting, which I've just said is the opposite. They like that they stay underweight or overweight or whatever it is. They're scared of not being able to cope without their behaviours. But when a depression comes into that can be a big motivating force. And for me, a part of why I started eating normally again was because I was tired of being depressed. And at that point, I didn't know whether my depression was because of my eating disorder. I've said it to people now who've recovered that I struggle or would struggle to diagnose a person professionally when they have an eating disorder with another illness, because I think that when a person is eating disordered and using behaviours, it interacts with everything, it interferes with everything. It interferes with the biology, psychology, your mental state, how you feel spiritually towards yourself. And it's only when you deal with all of that and you're giving your body the nutrients that it needs in the way that it needs, and you're doing some form of self-care and even restoring weight, that you can tell whether you have depression or not. I dealt with a lot of my issues with my eating disorder and my self-harm, and I still have a mood disorder. As to what that mood disorder is has been questioned. When I was eating disordered, I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder as well. I show no traits of that or exhibit any of the criteria for that. But that's because I'm recovered from my eating disorder. And I think that that's something that you have to address initially. What happens with a lot of people with eating disorders and self-harm is that the self-harm is seen as being the most dangerous, especially when that comes with suicidal ideation or suicidal activity, which I agree needs to be dealt with. More often than not, the eating disorder is looked over because of the severity of the self-harm. My self-harm was very severe, and a lot of people's is because it doesn't matter what you're doing to yourself, the fact that you're hurting yourself is bad enough. But you need to, when you go into recovery, like I said at the beginning of this video, it needs to encompass the whole person. And that whole person, eating disorder, self-harm, whatever other behaviours come, you can't address one and neglect the other. You have to deal with it. So when I was in recovery, I needed to start eating and I needed to keep myself safe. There was no point in me starting to eat and restore my weight if I was self-harming the whole way through it. You have to do all of it. And if you can get to a place where your behaviours are stabilised, you can then look at what is going on. I still had a form of depression when I came out of my eating disorder. It was nowhere near as severe, but it was still there. I now deal with manic and depressive episodes, but I'm dealing with that, I'm managing that, the medication is managing that. And so that's what I'd ask of you, is to treat yourself as a whole person. You are a whole person and you need to be treated as a whole being. And whether these issues, the depression, self-harm, eating disorder is there, when you go into treatment or you go into therapy or you recover, you have to look at yourself as a whole and deal with all of those things at once, not separate them out. And I'm going to go now, guys, because I'm running out of time. So I will see you next week. Okay, take care. Okay, bye.